So, as you might already know, about 33, 34, 35 years ago, we homeschooled our children, and I was designated the grammar teacher. My wife didn't want to bother with it. So I used an old grammar book, not this one, but it was an old one like this, back in the 90s. And here's another one. These are really nice books. I still like them. But anyway, the whole point is, when I was teaching them, I didn't have time to go deep into it. But I started to get ideas. And I've shared those ideas in my videos. You might have seen them. And basically, all my ideas come or fall under one general heading or topic, and that's the sentence. In other words, that's the way I looked at the sentence. My perspective, all right, of the sentence gave me those other ideas. All my other ideas came from this. So today I'd like to talk about the source of my ideas, and I call it sentence formation. In other words, how to make a sentence. And I have four main features here that come under the category of sentence formation. I call them design factors, divisions, predicate patterns, and elements. So this is just my perspective, my view, my own personal little grammar system, and I'd like to share it if you have a few minutes. Now, here's the four sentence formation features. So let's do them out of order. Let me start with divisions first, okay? To keep it simple, a sentence basically has two divisions. You have your subject division and your predicate division. You'll see this in almost any grammar book, or you'll see it online. That's very simple. And then there's sentence patterns. Now, I call them predicate patterns, but most books will call them sentence patterns, but I call them predicate patterns because in these patterns, the subject is always it's always in the same place. It doesn't go anywhere, all right? And you have pattern number 1, number 2, that's direct object. Number 3 has a subject complement. Number 4 has an indirect object and a direct object. And number 5 has a direct object and an object complement. And then there are many, many variations, but you can find this in almost any grammar book, so that's very simple. So you can see clearly that the options and variations are pretty much always on the predicate side. So I just call it predicate patterns because that's the key feature. Now the next thing on our list, we'll do this out of order. We'll talk about elements, sentence elements. Sentence elements are pretty much what you'd call words or parts of speech. This is where I start to stray. This is where I start to go off into my own personal perspective and do my thing that you see in most of my videos. I always have a weird way of thinking. So to me, the sentence elements are the base elements and the amplified elements. The base are very simple. The base are simply single or compound words, right? Very, very simple. And the amplified elements are combinations of base elements. And these combinations are almost limitless. So here you see, under the base category, you have your typical noun, pronoun, verb, adverb, adjective, preposition, conjunction, interjection, determiner, and I have in my own system an indicator. That's my own special thing, which you will see in my videos. So I have another category here, but that's the base sentence elements. Then the amplified sentence elements could be just about almost anything. You'll get like noun phrases, preposition phrases, all different kind of phrases and clauses. I have some examples here. You can take a look at it, but the point is almost any combination of words which forms phrases and clauses would be your amplified sentence element, right? You would just call them phrases, clauses, whatever. Now the phrase, okay, isn't going to have a subject and it's not going to have a verb in it ordinarily. And the clause, all right, the clause will have a subject and it will have a verb. So that way you can identify each. So my sentence elements, all right, are base, which is ordinarily just a single word or maybe a compound word like ice cream, something like that. And then the amplified are the combinations of those base elements or base words. So that's very simple. Now, let's move on to design factors. Okay, I'm doing this out of order, but that's okay. Now we'll look at design factors. Okay, we're doing this out of order, but that's okay. We'll look at design factors. And in my way of thinking of the sentence, I have 4 design factors: lexical, syntactic, contextual, and semantic. Lexical pretty much means, roughly speaking, word choice. All right. And if you're using an analogy of, let's say, building a building, you would have this as the material aspect, okay? The material that you use. Syntactic, you might say roughly, is word order. And then the building analogy, that would be your construction part, the actual construction. Contextual, right? That's the interrelation aspect of your design factors. And in the analogy, that would be the complex. In other words, the buildings as they sit together in a complex or in an industrial center or in a neighborhood, whatever. And then there's the semantic factor, all right? And that pretty much refers to meaning. And in the building analogy, that would be the utility feature. In other words, the usefulness and the purpose of this building, all right, as it sits and is used with the other buildings, okay? So there's your 4 factors. Design factor number 1 is lexical. That's your base elements. In this category, they're all base elements. Remember the sentence elements? And here we're talking about word choice, all right? Now, the old word that they used for word choice was diction. That was one of the original. But now they use that usually to refer to the way people enunciate and the way they talk. And that's why we have different accents in different parts of our country. But anyway, the point is, word choice used to be the word diction, and that's why we have the word dictionary. That's where you get your words. But a dictionary is also called a lexicon, and that's where we get our word lexical, okay? Word choice. So a lexicon and a dictionary are almost the same. Now, the key thing here is your base elements. Each word has a definition, all right? It has a definition. You can look in the dictionary and see that, all right? A sense of meaning is possible at this first level. In other words, sense of meaning, that means semantic, the semantic factor, but a sense of meaning here is possible already at this first level, all right? Non-word systems. Okay, if you didn't have words, if you didn't have just basic words, you'd have to use logograms like the Chinese and Japanese use. That squiggly, all that stuff they do, it's horrible, but you'd have to use that. Or you'd have to use an ideogram or a pictogram. So I'm really grateful, seriously, that here in America, with American English, that we have just basic words or basic elements, and it makes for writing and speaking and understanding, it makes it pretty easy. English is a pretty good language. Design factor number 2 is syntactic. All right, that comes from the word syntax. And here we're talking about word order and word position. All right. Now this design factor applies to amplified elements. In other words, this factor is used with groups of elements, groups of words. So just roughly speaking, we could say syntax is the way in which words are arranged to form grammatically sound phrases, clauses, and sentences. Now, here's an example. See, in the lexical factor, you'll notice that a word can have more than one definition. So let's look at this here. I will run 1 lap around the track. And we think that's a verb, all right? The team's youngest player scored the winning run. So now we see that that's a noun. And we can see the difference here between a verb and noun. In other words, you have one base element here, but it has 2 different definitions. And you can see each definition is used correctly in each one of these sentences. So that's important. Meaning is affected by the word's position. And you can see that clearly in each sentence. Meaning is affected, in other words, brought about by the word's position. Now, when I say position up here, also, I want to say that you're talking about position of the base element, all right, in a phrase or a clause, or you're talking about the position of the amplified element. In other words, that's a phrase or a clause in a sentence. I'll say that again. You're also talking about position of the amplified element, in other words, a group of words in a sentence. So that's your syntactic design factor. Design factor number 3 is contextual. That comes from the word context. The phrase we use commonly is in context. In context means that a given thing is considered together with any surrounding words or circumstances. When something happens, the conditions that exist where and when that something happens must be taken into consideration. Now here's an example. Someone shouts fire. If heard during a church service, this would mean that the church was on fire. If heard at the shooting range, it would prompt the officer trainee to shoot. So you see here, the situation here, somebody's shouting fire. It has to be taken in context. Here you have somebody who thinks the church is on fire, or God's punishing the congregation. Or here you have a policeman in training learning how to shoot. So that's very simple. You're probably familiar with that. Design factor number 4, we call semantic, and we're talking about meaning, because the Greek word semantikos means to mean. So it's pretty much the same word. All right? Meaning doesn't just magically happen on its own. Meaning is affected and reinforced during the process of sequentially moving through the application of the design factors. Each time you move up one level, a given passage's meaning becomes more clear. So let's take a little bit deeper look at that. In the mind, the sense of meaning and comprehension happens at super speed, faster than the speed of light, actually. But here's a quick example of the progression, all right? Let's say we have meaning levels, all right? Levels or degrees, all right? Well, meaning level number 1, your design factor is lexical, and you're dealing with base elements. In other words, your sentence elements are base. They're just words, all right? The enabling aspect, all right, of this level number 1, the enabling aspect is the fact that each word has a definition, okay? Now, you move to level 2, and we're at the syntactic design factor level, all right? And that's the level with amplified elements. In other words, groups of words, groups of base words, all right? Phrases, clauses. The enabling aspect, the thing that enables a greater sense of meaning, see, we're progressing here, is the fact that the word has a specific position. It has a specific place. So you see, we moved from level 1 to 2, and the meaning became more clear. Then there's meaning level 3 in my system. Remember, this is just a personal thing I do, my own grammar, is the contextual level. And in that level, you'll see base and amplified elements. You'll see single words, or you'll see groups of words. And the enabling aspect, the aspect that helps you have even greater understanding and greater sense of meaning, right, is reasoning. You're just basic reasoning. Now, there are even higher levels, and I call them meta, which means beyond. At the meta level, you would have, let's say, somebody says something, and you perceive in that something a double or triple entendre, but that's very deep. I won't go into that now. So that's your meaning progression, okay? So the whole point of this video is to show that way back decades ago, when we were homeschooling the children, I had to teach the sentence, and it really got my brain turned on. I started to think about grammar and things, but it all came from the sentence, and basically it came from the idea or the concept of having base elements, in other words, single words or parts of speech, whatever you want to call it, and amplified sentence elements, which is basically groups of words. So it all came from that. And from the base element perspective, I got my study of the word that. I did an extensive study on the word that, all right? And I took the word that as an abstract proform, changed it into an associator, and finally ended up making it, designating it as the distinction indicator, all right? That's how I got my distinction indicator, and I discovered that it was actually a noun clause indicator. And then I went on to do amplified verb tense, but I got those ideas pretty much from the concept of just a base element. In other words, being able to see parts of speech in context more clearly, okay? And then the amplified level, from that I got my distinction phrase and clause, which you would call relative clause, horrible name, horrible. I developed a noun clause as far as it can go, farther than anybody, I think, on the internet. I developed and discussed a noun complement more extensively than I think anybody. I fixed and cleaned up the appositive, and I developed the condition phrase, which you would call an absolute phrase. That's a crappy name. But the point is, all my grammar ideas and all my impetus to do grammar came from just looking at the sentence and saying, hey, what is it really? What's happening here inside this sentence? And that's what this video was about. So thanks for watching, and thanks for being incredibly patient. And I'm out of here.